welcome to the Extreme Hangout stage. Thank you for all staying so late. It does feel a little late now. It's been kind of hot today. A few people have done a little bit of work around here. I know the rest of you are all just lounging around. Marvelous. It is an inordinately enormous pleasure to welcome our two guests to the stage this evening. Our planetary guardians, nonetheless. We have with us two incredible leaders in civil society and science for our planet. Delighted to welcome Jean, the founder and CEO of Virgin Unite, in conversation with none other than Johan Rockström, a world-leading scholar on water resources and developer of the revolutionary Planetary Boundaries frameworks. Please put your hands together and welcome them to our stage.
Can I say as I walk up just a massive thanks to the Extreme Hangout team, to Amber, to Angus, also to Anika and to Teresa. Just a huge thanks. You guys have been great. And can I also say a massive thanks to, where's Jess? Somewhere back there. Wave your hands, Jess, wherever you are, from the Planetary Guardians team. She's been amazing in helping pull this all together. So it is my greatest honor to be sitting up here with Johan. I actually stalked him like 12 years ago when I first heard about the planetary boundary science. I actually found that Sylvia Earle actually emailed it to me and said, I think it was almost 12 years ago, and said, we have to look at this right now. This is amazing. And so I remember going to see Johan. And Johan is not only an extraordinary scientist, he's an extraordinary human being who has dedicated his whole life to this work. So we are so honored to be partnering with him to help bring in the planetary guardians into the world. And this is a collective that is really focused on how do we lift the incredible planetary boundaries science that Johan will talk about in a minute. And how do we make it a measurement framework and an operating framework for the whole world. So it's an honor to be sitting on the stage with him today. And I'm going to interview him and have him talk a little bit about, first, what we thought we'd do is open a little bit about the planetary boundaries science, for those of you in the audience who may not. And firstly, can I just say thank you to all of you who are in the audience who stayed tonight this late for us. So a huge thank you for being here. And I should also say before we start, we want this to be a conversation, you guys. So I'm going to ask Johan some questions in the beginning, but then I'm really going to open up to all of you guys as well to ask questions. So we'll make sure that we make time for that. So Johan, I thought just to kick off, if you could maybe for 10 minutes or so, just give some background on the science and the amazing work that you've done.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Jean, and wonderful to be here. And it's such a good occasion, given at least that there's so much at stake around here at COP28. I hope we can link the planetary boundary science to the COP28 outcome as well. Well, you know, the story of the planetary boundary science, which I find really important to be aware of, is that it came about as essentially the inevitable outcome of 30 years of extraordinary advancements in Earth system science. So you could argue that if it hadn't been the planetary boundary framework that landed in 2009, some other scientist or some other group would have basically very, very close after that have come to the same conclusion, because we were at this evidence level where it was the natural next step in scientific advancements. That's how science advances. You know, it goes in piece of evidence, adding to one adding to the next, and suddenly you come to breakthrough points. And the three extraordinary advancements are the following. Number one is, you know, the 30, 40 years of observations on planet Earth showing the hockey stick pressures of exponential rise of everything from the classic carbon dioxide curve, but you can take any parameter of the Earth system that matters for the stability of the planet and for human well-being. They look the same. Up until 1950s, we have incremental change, and then bang, off we go in the great acceleration, and we have today so much evidence that we've entered a whole new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. So in 2006, the first publication of the great acceleration comes out in a report from the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, one of the big global environmental change programs at the time. The conclusion of the Anthropocene is actually proposed in 2002 by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, one of the three that saw for the first time the depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer, an area that you're so passionate about, Jean. So these were one set of evidence. We're now a geological force of change. We are, as humanity, starting to hit the biophysical hardwired sealing of the processes that regulates the whole planet. We're putting the planet at risk. The second set of evidence that forms the foundation of what became the Planetary Boundary Framework is that in 2008, the first tipping point science paper is published. It's led by Professor Tim Lenton at Exeter University, but it's also co-led by my predecessor at the Potsdam Institute, Professor John Schellenhuber. It's a seminal piece of work that for the first time provides the evidence that if you push big systems like the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Amazon forest too far, it crosses physical tipping points and feedback dynamics shift from dampening and keeping the system stable to self-reinforcing and warming and pushing them irreversible in the wrong direction. So we had, for the first time, evidence that if you push systems too far across boundaries, they risk to shift and drift off in directions that not only pushes the planet in the wrong direction, but can also undermine life support for all species, including humans, on planet Earth. Published in 2008. The work started many years before. The third and final piece of evidence, which was the real breakthrough point, was all the paleoclimatic research that had been ongoing for decades, showing that we, over the last 1 million years, you've seen the data, you know, that we have 8-9 periods of so-called Milankovitch cycles, 100,000 years of ice age, and 15 to 30,000 years of interglacials, this dancing of the planet, driven by our orbital forcing in our elliptic journey around the sun, landing in the conclusion that we as humans have been around on planet Earth for 250,000 years. We've lived through 2 ice ages, 2 interglacials, but we leave the last ice age 20,000 years ago, and we enter this extraordinarily stable interglacial that, as you may remember from school, we learned to baptize as the Holocene. And we have so much evidence that the Holocene is this extraordinarily stable state. The first time you and I met, Jean, I remember that you were so taken aback because I even used the word the Garden of Eden to represent the Holocene. But the Holocene is a breakthrough point coming from ice core science, it's glaciology, the paleoclimatic evidence, combine that with archaeology and history that show that when we enter the Holocene, you know, we're hunters and gatherers, we live in deep ice age, we've been around for 250,000 years, we're a few million people, we have very rough conditions, it's very variable environmental conditions. We leave the last ice age, we enter the Holocene, and we barely enter it, and we go through the most important revolution in all of human history, the Neolithic. We become farmers, we domesticate animals and plants, and off we go in the civilizational journey as we know it. And we have so much evidence today that the reason why we domesticate animals and plants is that everything we love, everything we depend on, all the beauty in the ocean, in the ice sheets, in ecosystems, settle down in the Holocene. Can you imagine the planet? This is pre-planetary boundary evidence. The planet is a 14 degrees Celsius average temperature unit, plus minus 0.5. Plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. That is the corridor of life that has enabled us to reach 8 billion people in the globalized world of the Anthropocene. You put these 3 pieces of evidence together, the unique stability of the Holocene, which gives us something to measure against, the desired state of the planet. Tipping points are hardwired, push us beyond boundaries, and the system can start drifting away from that state. And the fact that the Anthropocene forces us to understand that the planet is this interconnected system with pressure points. Put that all together, and of course 2 questions arise. Question number 1, what are the biophysical processes that regulates the state and the functioning of the Earth system? And question number 2, if you have identified those boundary systems, can we scientifically quantify a safe operating space that gives us a high chance of keeping the planet in an interglacial, Holocene-like state that we know for certain can support humanity? And ta-ta, the planetary boundary theory is established. So that is what brought us to that point. And I say theory because many times people say wrongly that planetary boundaries is a concept. It's not a concept. It's a whole framework. It's a whole theory of humanity's relationship to planet Earth. And it's a theory that can be replicated by any research group with any methodology because it's set very clearly what the criteria are. to quantify a safe operating space for boundaries beyond which you risk triggering irreversible changes and a drift away from an interglacial state, but within which you have a high likelihood of remaining in that basin of attraction, the Holocene basin of attraction. And when we brought that theory to science, I invited scholars from all the disciplines. You know, I wanted us to turn every stone in the scientific evidence. So you got ecologists and glaciologists and climate scientists and oceanographers from all disciplines, just asking them that question. What are the biophysical processes that regulates the state of the planet? And can we quantify for key control variables the safe boundary conditions? And off we went. And this is in 2007, 2008, 3 years of work, inviting to a whole series of workshops. And it led to the first publication in 2009 in Nature. And what essentially everyone forgets is that that original paper, where we identified 9 planetary boundary systems, we quantified only 7. We couldn't quantify aerosol loading and novel entities, chemical pollution. And what everyone forgets is that in that paper we say, this is a theory that we're launching. We are proposing this as a challenge to the scientific community. We invite you all to criticize it, break it apart, help us now to perfect this framework. It's published in the world's most prestigious scientific journal, Nature. There's an editorial written confirming that this is a challenge to the scientific community. It's such a big challenge that for the first and only time in science, the review reports, because of course the paper was peer-reviewed, the review reports are published in Nature. So there's one review report for each of the 9 boundaries published in Nature with the critical assessments of these 9, just to really stay with the science. And that was published in 2009 and became that year's kind of one of the most cited papers in science. And that triggered the journey that then has taken us to the Extreme Dialogue at COP28 in Dubai. I mean, basically, it started a scientific inquiry into whole new science of how to basically monitor the whole planet, define the safe space, and over 2,000 peer-reviewed papers have been published since then, criticizing bending in and out. We published the first update in 2015, the second update in 2023 this year, and you and I were part of basically launching that at the New York Climate Week in September. And it's been, you know, exactly as when science is at its best. It's been inviting super hard criticism from the hydrology and water resource science community, improving the quantifications, adding new control variables. We have new control variables on biodiversity thanks to the ecologists coming on board with new assessments. So I won't bore you with all the numbers here. I can point you on the 2023 update led by Catherine Richardson in that third update. But it's now a mature framework. And my conclusion is, just to close this, to say that the science is not settled, by the way, but what I can say with high degree of confidence today is that nobody has suggested a 10th boundary. And I can assure you, between us in this room, that when we were really developing this theory in 2008, we were hoping for 10. We thought it would be quite symbolic, that would be 10 planetary boundaries that determines the fate of creation, so to say, for humanity. But we couldn't find a 10th, and nobody has suggested scientific evidence for a 10th. But nobody has either suggested that there were only 8. So I think we can today say with high degree of confidence that if we can be stewards of these 9 boundaries, we have a good chance of keeping the planet at a state that can give us a dignified, prosperous, and equitable future for humanity on Earth. That I can say with high degree of confidence today. I cannot say with full confidence that we've got the quantifications right on all the 9. It's still work in progress. For climate, we are really, it's really well established. Stay well below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's the boundary. On biodiversity, we've come a long way. On fresh water and land as well. I would argue that we're really good on ozone, but we still have work to do on aerosol loading. We still have work to do on novel entities, on chemicals. On oceans, we still have work to do to get biology in the ocean on board fully. Sylvia Earle is
Sylvia Earle.
continuously criticizing that. The boundary on oceans is actually set as ocean acidification. I realize, just to count the 9 so you've heard them once and for all, and in a way that helps me to remember them as well. So, because I cluster them in three families. The first are the 3 big systems that have evidence of tipping points at the planetary scale. The climate system, the climate planetary boundary, the ocean boundary, stable oceans, and the stratospheric ozone layer, the protective ozone layer that keeps us away from dangerous UV radiation. Those are the 3 big ones. Then you have the biosphere boundaries, the boundaries that actually do not have scientific evidence of planetary scale tipping points. There are tipping points at the lower biome scale, but they regulate under the hood of the Earth system the stability of the big 3. And these are biodiversity, land systems, so the configuration of big ecosystems like Amazon rainforest, permafrost, wetlands, peatlands. The third one is, of course, the bloodstream of the Earth system, the hydrological cycle, the cycle of fresh water. And the fourth one is the sister cycles to carbon on nutrients, so what we call biogeochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus flows. These are what we call the biosphere boundaries. These are the ones that are in living nature, okay? And they don't have planetary scale tipping point evidence, but they determine the outcome on the climate system, for example, because they have the carbon stocks and sinks that determines the stability of the climate system. And then finally you have what I a bit sloppily, but it's good to remember, I call them the aliens. The 2 remaining boundaries, and they are alien because they don't exist naturally in the Earth system. We have created them. And one is all the chemical compounds, you know, the PFAS, the endocrine disruptors, the nuclear waste, the microplastics. And the second one is aerosol loading, all the air pollutants that dims the lower atmosphere, changing monsoon systems over South Asia, for example. Air pollutants for simplicity. So you have 2 aliens, chemical pollution and aerosol loading, 4 nature set ones, biogeochemical flows, freshwater cycling, land system configuration and biodiversity, and then you have the 3 big ones, the ocean, the stratosphere, and the climate system. Those are the 9. Just I can tell you, when we published this the first time, we did not know at all how many there would be. They could have landed as 50. They could have been 3. But however we twist and turn this, we cannot find more evidence for more nor for less than these 9. And I think that is, personally, I find that really reassuring.
And I think, I think one of the things we absolutely love about this framework that you've created is that it does give you a whole planet view. And what's really interesting is humanity right now, we've kind of put climate over here and we forgot about the rest of the planet.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear from you, Johan. How can understanding the planetary boundaries help us reach our climate goals? And if we don't do that, what are the risks associated with tipping points between boundaries as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned tipping point science in the beginning. So we use tipping point science to guide us in quantifying the safe boundaries. So to put it simple, we set the boundaries to avoid crossing tipping points. And the tipping point science is therefore there to help us in these quantifications. But the planet, I would go as far today, and I say that in all events here at COP28, that we will fail on delivering on the Paris Agreement. There is no safe 1.5 degrees Celsius landing without coming back within a safe operating space of planetary boundaries. It's that challenging, because we need to come back into the safe space on the climate boundary by phasing out fossil fuels and phasing out all the non-CO2 gases of methane and nitrous oxide. So the control variables for the climate boundary is 350 ppm on CO2 concentration, but also 1 watts per square meter on climate forcing, representing all the greenhouse gases. But then we also know that even if we are successful in phasing out fossil fuels, even if we are at a net zero world economy by 2050, we will still crash through the climate boundary unless we come back in on the biodiversity boundary the land boundary, and the nitrogen boundary and the phosphorus boundary. So we've published planetary boundary science research showing that even if we are successful in phasing out fossil fuels, we will exceed 1.5 just because we are outside a safe space on the biosphere boundaries. And we know also that, that the aerosol boundary is a really tricky one because air pollutants tend on net to cool the planet. So this is a paradox. It's what Jim Hansen, co-author of the first Planetary Boundary paper, one of the world's leading climate scientists, as you know, the scientist who gave the first testimony in the US Congress in 1989 on climate. He calls this the Faustian bargain because transgressing the aerosol boundary cools the planet within the order of 0.5 degrees Celsius, so roughly 1 watt per square meter. This is causing premature death of up to 8 million people per year and the smog in cities, but it's cooling the planet. So we have one major challenge, transgressing the climate boundary, causing major climate crisis. But the crisis is even worse because transgressing the aerosol boundary is actually cooling the planet and hiding a significant part of the climate death that we've caused. If you would clean up all the cities in the world and come back into the safe space on the aerosol boundary, you would actually immediately bump up warming with roughly 0.5 degree Celsius. So these are two boundaries that interact. So we need to recognize that all the nature boundaries and the chemicals and air pollution boundaries interact to determine the outcome for climate. So we are here in Dubai, and we're talking about a climate policy challenge, but in fact, it's a global sustainability challenge. It's a return back to a safe operating space to have a chance on delivering 1.5. And just to put that finally in a perhaps an even sharper way, which is that you may be aware that in the IPCC latest assessment, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are two sets of scenarios that can take us to 1.5. One of them are those that take us directly to 1.5. And we conclude today, we've just had a press conference on this, that the pathway direct to 1.5 is closed, unfortunately. We're not making progress. There's so much warming in the pipeline that we cannot any longer move directly to 1.5. So our only chance to hold on to 1.5, which is a really serious climate planetary boundary, so I'm in full support to keep it alive, is through a period of overshoot. So this means that the best we can do today is to unfortunately accept crashing through the climate boundary 2030, 2035, and have a period of overshoot before we can come back to 1.5 by the end of the century. That is, really bad news, because it will mean 30, 40 years at best of 1.7, 1.8 transgression of the planetary boundary, even more extreme events, more droughts, more floods, more heat waves, potentially crossing tipping points. We do not know fully. We can come back to that. But then come back to 1.5. Now, science shows that this is possible. But why would we come back? What is it that makes us able to land back at 1.5 by the end of the century? Well, I can tell you the only reason we can come back is if we can keep the biosphere boundaries in the safe space. Mm-hmm. So that is quite dramatic. It means that the only way to keep 1.5 alive is that we do two things simultaneously. One is phase out fossil fuels, and two is to take care of nature by coming back in the safe space of the biodiversity boundary, the land boundary, the freshwater boundary, and the nutrient boundaries. So this is the message in Dubai. It's a planetary boundary guided transition back to a safe climate future. So planetary boundary science is about the planet. Mm. It's an integrated Earth system framework, sure, but it really is, I would argue, what should be guiding what we are focusing in on here over the next week as well. Mm. It's totally connected.
And what would you say, Johan, because this is we have 84 months left until 2030 right now. Mm. So we have a short window to do this. What would you say to everyone here of what kind of messages we should be giving to people in the blue zone that are doing the negotiating right now? What are the things that we have to leave Dubai with? Mm.
Yes, I would, and we, and I say we in the climate science community, I think are quite clear in our messaging to COP28, which is that, so, I mean, I just finished by saying that this is a big agenda. It's a global sustainability transition, but we need to be helping the blue zone. We need to help our dear climate negotiators, and therefore I argue quite strongly that this has to be the mitigation COP. This has to be the COP when we get serious on fossil fuel phase out. We have to, recognize that we need to deliver on the energy transition, but also on getting back within the safe operating space on all the planetary boundaries. But we're not making progress on any of these, so therefore this is probably our last chance to get serious on the fossil fuel phase out. So if we do not, on all challenges we have, that I would argue is the number one. And to help the negotiations of the next few days, I think it is helpful to say, look here, you have this series of carbon budgets you have to deal with simultaneously. Carbon budget number one is to phase out fossil fuels. Carbon budget number two is to have a food system transition from emitting carbon to sequestering carbon, because what the agricultural system is doing is destroying ecosystems, emitting more carbon, so it's affecting the land boundary, it's affecting the biodiversity boundary, but it's also adding nitrous oxide and methane, so in the nutrient boundary. So therefore, you have a second carbon budget that also needs to be acted upon in parallel. And then you have the third one, which we just talked about, the intact nature one, the ocean one, the fourth one, and scaling of carbon dioxide removal technologies as a fifth one. So all of these have to be acted upon simultaneously. And you cannot, as been a tendency already here at COP, to start saying, well, we can actually not go as fast as science says on carbon dioxide emission cuts, meaning fossil fuel phase out, so we will accept that we need to compensate that with carbon dioxide removal technologies instead. Well, that doesn't work, because the climate models that can keep us at 1.5 actually have already factored in that we will be successful on all of these carbon budgets. So the climate models have actually already assumed that we will not be in the red on the climate, on the nature boundaries, and the models already assume that we will be able to start scaling carbon dioxide removal technologies. So I think what has to happen here is quite simply focusing in on fossil fuel phase out, and that the timeline for that is scientifically well set, cutting emissions by half every decade, so 50% cuts by 2030, 6% cuts every year, bending the global curve of emissions no later than 2025, in 2 years' time. That, I think, is the number one step. But we can use the planetary boundary evidence to make the case even stronger. To say that, dear friends, you have so many challenges here that needs to be acted upon simultaneously. So let's get on with the easy one, the phase out of fossil fuels.
And the science is really clear that we have to do that first one, phasing out fossil fuels, or else we won't make it.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite, but it's kind of the number one. That's why I had a really good exchange with Sultan Al Jaber yesterday, congratulating him for the decision to now put money into the loss and damage fund.
Yeah.
And I actually was quite direct with him to say that, because this means that you can now put aside that whole agenda. It's a really important one. It almost filled the whole negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. We could spend 2 weeks to talk about loss and damage. But fantastic that you've now settled that one so you can focus on the mitigation agenda. And he said, yes, that's our plan. He totally agreed on that. And that to me was very reassuring.
Yeah. And would you, Johan, because with 6 out of the 9 boundaries breached right now, it can sometimes feel overwhelming. But I think one of the things that you taught me early on was the story of hope in the planetary boundaries model, around the ozone model. So I'd love for you to talk to the audience and inspire them just as you did to me.
Yeah, no, but I mean, and before coming to the, let's say, open window part, you're right. Our latest assessment, the 2023 Planetary Boundaries Science Update, shows that 6 of the 9 boundaries are transgressed, so they're outside of the safe space. This does not mean that the planet has fallen over an escarpment. It means that we are in a danger zone, for some of them even in a high-risk zone. So we can unfortunately expect interactions and impacts, but we see this as a warning sign that can help us to come back within a safe space. I try to my students, make the analogy that, before we had the Planetary Boundary science, it's like we're running the world as an overpowered vehicle in pitch darkness on a mountain road with huge dangerous escarpments without any guardrails. And we're speeding too fast without any headlights on. And that's not a very comfortable position to be in. What the Planetary Boundary science does is turns on the headlights and it puts a safe guardrail. So basically it gives us the safety net to navigate our future. To me, that's a very positive message that we are in danger, yes, but we now have turned on the headlights, the science is clear, and we actually have the guardrails. We have the boundaries that you do not want to pass. So that is one reassurance. The second reassurance is that we know the 2 transitions that can take us back. I mean, not in full, but can give us the biggest bang for the buck. And the number 1 is, we already talked about that, the energy transition. The second one is the food system transition. And when you look at these 2, we have the scalable solutions. That's quite exciting. It's not fantasy anymore that you can actually transition into a decarbonized world economy and a healthy, sustainable food future. And by doing so, we have so many scientific papers today showing that you can then come back on the land boundary, the biodiversity boundary, the freshwater boundary, the nitrogen phosphorus boundaries. So that's good. But finally, the question that I often get is that, so you're suggesting that we need to be guardians of the whole planet. That seems just too big, too difficult. 195 countries, how can we agree to manage a planetary threat? Well, the answer is we've done it before. And we've done it before with the ozone boundary. Because in the early 1980s, we were emitting chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, freons, that we used to cool our refrigerators, our air conditioners, a very potent greenhouse gas, but also a chemical that was very, very efficient in functioning as a cooling agent in our technologies, but that once released was destroying and depleting the stratospheric ozone layer. Now science, quite serendipitously, was able to prove the chemistry behind that ozone depletion in the stratosphere, and was able to communicate that to policy. Nobody had seen an ozone hole, but it was communicated to science, to policy. Policy listened, and it led to the Montreal Protocol in 1987. Industry was quite rapidly on board and trusted science, acted on policy to innovate itself towards non-ozone damaging cooling agents, which we are now using in the world. And the Montreal Protocol was adopted with such success and implemented upon that NASA could inform the world just 2 years back that we were starting to close the ozone hole, the worst hole being over Antarctica. So we can today conclude that the ozone boundary, which was in the red in the 1980s, has come back into the safe space now, just recently. I mean, it just shows the sensitivity that you cause a danger, and it took us 20 years to come back, but we are today closing in that hole. It was an existential threat to human and other species' life in the southern hemisphere on planet Earth. And the interesting thing with that story is that the world listened to science and acted upon science on a threat that was not immediate. It wasn't as if it was like a pandemic threat. It's just like the climate crisis, a creeping crisis that we did not see immediately. Nobody could go out of their door and say, I'm feeling a threat from the ozone hole, but there was a trust and acting on that science. So we've been planetary stewards on the ozone boundary, but remember, we have the legally binding Paris Agreement on the climate boundary. Remember, we have COP15 last year in Montreal on the global biodiversity framework, which is addressing a global agreement on the biodiversity boundary. So it's not as if we are not doing attempts, and we have made some progress on climate, biodiversity, and solved the ozone boundary transgression. So in that sense, I think we should celebrate the fact that we have done it before, and it means that we can, of course, do it again.
And I think it's really important what you iterated again and again, which is we listened to science, we created policies that then gave clarity to industry, and then it allowed industry to act across competitive lines and come together collectively. It was just an extraordinary, and some of the incredible ozone leaders that have been working on this now for, some of them, over 30, 40 years now, which is just extraordinary. And we have an opportunity, I think, to do the same thing right now with the climate crisis and bringing back the other planetary boundaries, which again is the beauty of the model, because it gives you a framework that allows you to put things into perspective where you can act upon them and understand, because we were talking about the global stock take the other day, which is so important and so critical right now, and people need to listen to that, and we also need a planetary boundaries health check alongside that stock take, because otherwise we don't know how we're doing. We don't know if we're really making impact. We don't know if we're really pulling ourselves back into that safe operating space. So I think the two have to go hand in hand, and we need to invest in the science to make sure that, which is the reason the ozone was such a success, is the British Antarctic Survey invested in the science from 1957, and so in 1987 they had trend data for 30 years, as you know, and if we hadn't had that trend data, we wouldn't have been able to prove that there was a hole near the South Pole. And I remember the wonderful Robert Swan, who was the first person to walk unassisted to both the North Pole and the South Pole, was under the South Pole was near the South Pole in 1986 when those three incredible scientists proved the hole. And talking to him, he talks and says that my face was almost ripped off by the ultraviolet light. And he said his eyes actually turned from brown to blue permanently from that damage. And he talks a lot about being the canary in the coal mine for the ozone problem, because he talks about how we would have had to become nocturnal creatures. Our whole food system would have collapsed. And I think we're at that same moment right now of urgency of how we act. And your eloquent framing of science, policy, and industry. And all of us need to figure out how we make that happen. And I'm going to open up to the audience just for questions now. But I wondered if we can play the video just quickly, because one of the things we've been really privileged to work with Johan on is bringing together these incredible 14 planetary guardians that come from all different generations, they come from all different cultures, and they come from all different sectors. And their job...
Humanity is at a critical juncture.
We're in the midst of this unprecedented global crisis. We're at risk of destabilizing the whole planet. But as science shows so far, the window is still open for us to have a future for humanity where we can remain within the planetary boundaries.
We have to understand what's going on and why. We are moving in the right direction. What the planetary boundaries will do is help us to really gather our strengths together. I want the G20, the G7, the UN Security Council to be guided by the planetary boundaries.
Nature is not limitless, and it's a living system. We know very well the value of a dead nature, unfortunately, but we haven't really appreciated the value of a living planet. And this is really what the planetary boundary does. It's that science that says the value of a living planet is incredible.
If we don't work together, if we don't cooperate, every country, every region, all of us, we will never achieve the objectives.
We are youth of extraordinary ambition and creativity and energy, but we cannot do what we want to do if we don't have our wisdom to guide us, experience to guide us.
We have thousands of years of wisdom from our ancestors. And imagine if we combine those best knowledge of indigenous peoples and the science and technology, we can have the best tools who can fix all the problems that we are facing now.
There are so many things that everybody and each of us can do.
We are all guardians. You are guardians. Your decision can help the planet to thrive.
We must all take our responsibility and feel not just the responsibility, but also the privilege of being guardians of our future.
We've got this. So let's walk on Earth like we love her, every step with the wisdom of our ancestors and the power and spirit and the guidance of future generations.
It's the first time Johan saw it as well. So hopefully you like it. Good.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, and big thanks to Silverback, who did that film. It was just amazing. But we'd love to open up to all of you guys now to make sure that we have some time for questions. So I don't know if anyone has a mic. Yeah, thank you, Angus.
Thank you. So Stephen George, European Space Agency and the Plant-Based Treaty. Thank you for the great talk, and thank you for all the work that you do. It's really, really great work. So since this is the first COP that has a day dedicated to food systems, I wanted to ask the following. So scientists have warned us that even if we halt fossil fuels today, food emissions alone are enough to put the 1.5 and 2 degrees targets out of reach. Could you explain what the role of the global food system is in getting us back within the planetary boundaries? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's a really important question, and and particularly given the point I made earlier that I think the most important outcome at COP28 is really on the mitigation fossil fuel phase-out agenda, which of course has to do with the fact that we are at UAE and we have an oil and gas state convening the COP, which means that they have a particular responsibility but also convening power. But you're absolutely right, the food system transition is equally important. It's really essential that we all are aware that the only reason why the IPCC and the Planetary Boundaries Science gives us a carbon budget for a safe and orderly phase out of fossil fuels is that we've already factored in very optimistic assumptions on a food system transition. So the food system today emits, it will be released actually in 2 days' time, the latest version of the global carbon budget. 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide on average per year. It adds up to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent if you include the boundaries on nitrogen as well, because nitrous oxide, and then you have the methane part as well. But let's just focus on carbon dioxide for the moment. 4 is emitted. This is particularly encroaching on the land boundary, so expanding agriculture into intact nature, but also the production, land degradation, and all the diesel use and emissions from the production system itself is assumed to have a very positive and optimistic transition into becoming a net carbon sink of on average -5 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year within just 30 years' time. So this is, to your question, this is a major food system transformation. I even call this an agricultural revolution from +4 to -5 in one generation. Now, that is interesting and necessary. It's interesting because we have quite a lot of evidence that this is possible to do. And not only is it possible to do, it's part of the very rapidly emerging nature positive agenda. That to do this, you have to invest in different forms of regenerative, nature positive, or sustainable intensification measures, everything from conservation agriculture, abandoning plowing for minimum tillage systems, new crop rotations, better management of agricultural landscapes. I mean, we could go on a long time with all the practices that can be scaled to build more organic carbon and protect and build resilience in agricultural farming systems. The interesting with that is that it can only be achieved if you really use the boundaries on fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus, land, and biodiversity. Those are the guides for that food system transition. But they all add up to carbon, and they all add up to going from emitting to sequestering carbon. So yes, the food system transition is absolutely necessary. And to your point, yes, there is science showing that even if we phase out fossil fuels, the food system itself can make us go through the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you could say, of course, that just by agreeing on phasing out fossil fuels won't take us all the way. We need also major efforts on food transition. And then in that story, there's also health and malnutrition and inequities across the world in terms of how we handle the global food system. You have overconsumption in large parts of the world and underconsumption in vulnerable regions of the world. So it's also an enormous equity dimension. I should actually take the opportunity to mention that in my view, the Planetary Boundaries science, which is a natural science framework, it's an Earth system science framework, has a tremendous justice implication, because what it means is that you set finite boundaries. It translates to budgets, which has to be shared in an equitable way. So it's like in my view, the ultimate definition of justice. In the Anthropocene, where we're filling up the whole space on Earth, we need to share it in an equitable way. But if you put absolute boundaries, it really makes it very clear that you cannot do like, George W. Bush the Elder in 1992 at the Rio conference to say that the American lifestyle is not up for negotiations. Well, dear friends, it is up for negotiations today, because now we have this finite space defined by the planetary boundaries. And that's, I think, very helpful. And it addresses specifically the food system.
And I know there's some great people in this room actually working on the food system, so hopefully, but go in the front. I think there's a question right here. I don't know where, there it is. Thanks, Angus.
Thank you. Sarah Black from Creo Syndicate. A question around, so emissions at this point are the most understood, and we've taken the overall objective and taken it down into goals for specific organizations, governments, that are fairly well understood and measurable. Do you think a similar approach can be taken for the other boundaries that can make it quantifiable down to an organizational level, or we'll have to take a different approach?
No, the short answer is yes. And not only do I think it can be done, I think it must be done, because what happens with all the planetary boundaries is that these are absolute quantitative boundaries. They translate to budgets. So you have a nitrogen budget, a phosphorus budget, a water budget, a land budget, just like we have a carbon budget. And I often get this, what I would find like unwarranted critique that, yeah, sure, but the climate system is shared by all of us. The carbon budget is global. It makes sense for carbon, but it doesn't make sense for water or nitrogen. Well, I say, I'm sorry. When you think of it, the actions on the carbon budget are also local. It really is, in the end, translated to what you're doing with car exhausts, individual industries. It is sector-specific, scope 1 and 2 and 3. It is local actions that then add up to the global numbers. It's exactly the same thing with nitrogen. You have a global budget for nitrogen. It has to be broken down to companies, to cities, to countries, allocated in a fair way, and then you can act on it. So it's not any different to the carbon budget. Is this happening? The answer is yes. We are working in the Earth Commission. We're taking the planetary boundary science, and with social sciences, that's a whole new topic, but just keep it to the planetary boundary science, and translating that to science-based targets. So as you may know, in the climate space, which has come furthest here, The 1.5 boundary translates to carbon budget, gives us the trajectory to net zero by 2050, and is being used by the Science Based Target Initiative to give quantitative numbers for businesses. The Science Based Target Network is now doing the same thing for the other planetary boundaries. So we will soon have exactly the same operational science-based targets for businesses, for biodiversity, for nitrogen, for water. Not all the 9 boundaries, I think. I mean, this is really challenging to do for all of them, but we're moving in that direction. So I'm really excited about that you have the planetary boundary science, just like the climate science, and that you can take it all the way down to what does this mean for Dubai or Stockholm or New York, and what does it mean for companies from car industry to food industries.
And we'd welcome people that are interested in helping explore that. We're working with Johan, working with Global Commons Alliance, working with FAIR and a whole bunch of others to look at how we can operationalize it by industry, by city, by nation, because that's what we need as human beings. We need it as a center operational framework for measurement and how we exist as companies, how we exist as nations. So thank you for asking that question. I'll take one more question over here.
Thank you. So I'm Andrew Griffiths from Planet Mark and the Carbon Accounting Alliance. And so my question is really around working within these budgets and coming all the way down. Our industry, where the Carbon Accounting Alliance, for example, represents around over 50,000 company carbon footprints collectively among 158 carbon accounting bodies so far and growing very rapidly. What can our industry do to connect in with the work that you're doing, kind of from the top down level, and move that needle with all of the companies that we're working with to A, help them understand this, but B, get them to do what they need to do to shift industries, whether it be food, transport, whatever. How can we support? What would you have us do where I've got to figure out how to get this huge cabal of carbon accounting bodies doing something together? What would be the most useful, impactful thing to unlock and help drive forward?
Yeah, I think it links to your question as well. That and it's good that you mentioned that, Jean. That I would recommend that companies in a network like this connect to the Global Commons Alliance and interacts with the Science Based Target Network. But then I think it's fair to say, Jean, isn't it, that within the Planetary Guardians, there's such a large enthusiasm with the Boston Consulting Group, and we have Systemic and a group of consultancy-oriented organizations that want to connect the science with businesses in particular. So I think you should also knock.
Yeah, I'd love to chat with you, because we're working with a bunch of folks like Omidyar, our network, on doing capital flows mapping on commercial and philanthropic and also public finance. That's another thing we should say. I mean, we have subsidies. It's absurd that we have subsidies that are destroying the boundaries right now. So we need to be transparent, and we need to start shining a spotlight on the absurd as well. But so they're helping us do that mapping. But then we're also working with FAIR and others to do deep dives on, for example, factory farming, on also fertilizer, so that we can operationalize it. And Hero is one of the guardians, and Naoko and also Ralph Chammy are really excited about how do we value a living nature, because right now we're just extracting. So we would love to have a conversation with you about how we do that and operationalize it in your network as well, because the more people we can partner with, the more exciting it is right now.
But let me also just add finally that I think also that what was so a super important help that companies can provide us with is to help us change the whole narrative, because this often comes across wrongly as being an environmental topic or a sustainability topic. It's not. The moment it docks into companies or institutions or economies or cities, it is really about prosperity, about equity, about profitability in companies. It really docks into security and strategy. I mean, I think the reason why Mary Robinson is chairing or helping us now interim-wise, engaging so much in the Guardians is from a security, from a gender equity, from a well-being perspective. And I think we as sustainability scientists cannot really do that alone. We need help from that to reposition this whole agenda.
And I think that's such an important point, Johan, because when we look at that mapping, we see it as an innovation map. Because what was beautiful with the ozone layer, when they pulled it back into the green, they did that by creating new products, creating new services, creating new companies. And now we need entrepreneurs, we need companies to look at this as an opportunity model right now of where can we create business opportunities across these? Where can we pull back in? And the thing that I loved about the ozone layer is they also got industries together and worked across competitors to speed the process up. And we don't have time anymore. So we need to start thinking of how do we collaborate across competitive lines to speed the process up. So yes, I'm glad you brought that up because it is something that we're super excited about. We were in a room with a bunch of CEOs the other day, and you can see the lights go on in their eyes when they finally realize we have to start thinking in this way. We can't just start thinking in slices. We have to think in a planetary approach. And I'm conscious we're out of time, and Amber's coming up here right now. But it looks like there's one more question we can take. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Peter, and I'm part of Climate Science Limited. We run an Olympiad for youth. And I'm wondering, where does youth fit into this? That's the important part. They're the ones that really have the passion, the intelligence, all of the rest that are taking this forward. Where do they actually fit into this? How do they work through it?
Yeah, I'll let you go start, and then I can...
No, but Xia Bastida is one of the guardians. But that won't be enough, of course. You're absolutely right. I mean, we want, you know, this is an enormous step change for science. I mean, we're going to go from producing scientific updates every 7th year to now doing a planetary boundary health check every year. We'll be working with ESA and all the big data providers to get measurements of all the planetary boundaries, modeling, analysis every year. It will be just an enormous scientific step change. But the big excitement is when we try to translate this to messages, narratives, stories for the guardians, but also for the world.
Yeah.
And of course, we love to, you know, ideas of how we can connect with youth, with indigenous voices, with all walks of life to get this new paradigm truly anchored across the world. And so we will do our part in, I mean, that's another coincidence that we have Silverback that has been producing the life of David Attenborough's all films. They are fully on board with us. We have so much interest in helping us to get the science out, but I think we need a lot of invites on how to do this.
James Cameron from Avatar is also super excited about this. But to your question, one of the reasons, if you looked at the Guardians, almost half of them are young leaders. So we have Jia, we have Farwiza from Indonesia, we have Aisha Siddiqa from Pakistan, we have Hindu Ibrahim from Chad. And one of the reasons we selected those Guardians is because they have really broad reach and they're mobilizing young people all over the world. We just had a panel with them, and you know, Aisha, when I asked her, like, what is the biggest, best collaboration you've ever seen? And she's like, it's the youth movement right now. We are systematically moving on these things, and we are working, like she was talking about how at COP, they're all working together where they'll start in the morning, they'll all make a plan on what they're gonna do, and then they go out and each group does their own thing, and then they come back at night and plan a strategy for the next day. So we would love to team up with you as well, because one of the things we want to do is we want to stay lean as a planetary guardian. We want to work with partners to lift up. And that's why these 4 young leaders have joined forces with us to help. And one of the other really beautiful things at the very first Guardian meeting was actually seeing those 4 leaders have debate and disagreement with the other guardians, like Sylvia Earle and also Mary and President Santos, about what is the best approach. And that's the way we're going to drive change, is if we create these safe spaces for really honest intergenerational discussion. And that's not happening enough right now. So would love to chat with you about how we can work together. Yeah. So I'm sorry, we've gone over. I just want to, before we close, I just want to say thanks to Johan, not just for being here with us tonight, because he has a trillion things to do right now at COP, but I also want to say thanks for his decades and decades of building this model, of serving humanity. We can all never thank him enough, because he's doing this for all of us in this room right now, and he's going to hate me for saying this, but if we could all just give him a massive round of applause.
Thank you.